Dude, never did it.
Hello, welcome back to Never Did It, a movie podcast about watching movies that you'd never seen before, that you think you probably should have seen before. And so much so that you ask your friend to assign you movies to see that you've never seen before. I'm Brad Garoon, and I'm here with Jake Ziegler. What's up, Jake?
Well, I'm just ready to talk about one of the most famous films of all time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a movie today that definitely needs more reviews of it. It hasn't been talked about enough in the history of movies. But just a real quick rundown. Never Did It. Specifically, Jake and I assign each other one movie for each of the last 100 years that the other person hasn't seen before. Or in some cases that neither of us have seen before when we get back to these old movies like close to 100 years ago, that when both of us have a lot of gaps to fill. But on this day, we watched a couple of movies from 1941, including Citizen Kane, which is probably the most examined movie of all time. So I'm not sure what we're going to be able to say about it that hasn't been said before, but we'll give it a shot. Jake, you assigned me Citizen Kane. Can you tell me why?
Yes, and actually, I didn't assign it to you at first. I had a different movie on there. I put down the John Ford, How Green Was My Valley, just because that had beaten Citizen Kane for Best Picture. So I thought that might be an interesting thing to talk about. But then I realized that you hadn't seen Citizen Kane, and in addition to being the most talked about and analyzed and placed at the top of every film list ever, and broke so much new ground just in the ways they did certain things, techniques, cinematography, a lot of the things they did. I mean, it's been talked about so much. But also in addition to that, I think it just really holds up as a cool, entertaining movie with an amazing performance. And it's just, really worth watching regardless of all the hoopla around it.
Yeah, for sure. I had seen the first half hour of Citizen Kane because it was assigned to me in a film class in college, as it is assigned to everyone in every film class ever.
Film 101.
Yeah. But I remember, and what I remember thinking about it even back then, and that, let's see, freshman year of college was 20 years ago. But what I remember from back then is watching it and thinking, oh, I didn't know that old movies could look like this. That it wasn't a straightforward narrative. But even back then, I think 30 minutes, it does take a minute to get to the narrative. There's a very long flashback. There's not even a flashback, it's an obituary at the beginning of the movie. And I think back then, when I was 18, I couldn't get past it, or didn't want to. I had a lot more patience for it this time around. Mm-hmm. It's very cool. So I had a lot more patience for it this time around. But I was curious to get your thought on this. I have a few questions for you about Citizen Kane. Well, for those who don't know what Citizen Kane's about, if there are any of you, a newspaper man / politician / just rich dude dies in his old age, and a group, I think it's like a newsreel group, essentially, wants to find out what his dying words mean, and everyone knows now that his dying word was rosebud, and that's like the big often memed and copied and parodied bit of the movie. They want to know what it means, and so one of the guys from the newsreel company goes and visits acquaintances and former lovers, etc. of what's his name, Kane, Charles
Foster Kane. And
the movie is just like a series of vignettes and flashbacks from the stories that they tell him, which is pretty cool. I didn't know until I watched it. I'm like, this is very episodic, this movie. And I think today, it's not a long movie. It's like, I think just over 2 hours.
Yeah, it's in the 2-hour neighborhood.
Yeah. But I feel like if this movie were to come out today, it would be a 6-hour series, like, 12 episodes, 6 hours, 30 minutes an episode. It's a pretty funny movie as far as dramas go. And each episode would be like we learn more and more, and probably the payoff would be a little bit more than it was, a representation of his innocent childhood sled that gets burned. But what do you think? How do you think this? Because it's interesting. I was listening to the episode of Unspooled, which do you listen to Unspooled? Are you familiar with that at all?
Never did.
It's a movie. It's a movie podcast from Paul Scheer, and I feel bad I forget his co-host's name. She, I think, writes reviews for the Times. Or maybe a different newspaper. She's very good. Where they review just, it started by them reviewing the AFI 100.
Oh.
Yeah, and going back and seeing if they like those. But, so Citizen Kane was the first one they did. Anyway, Paul Scheer mentions that, no one's ever tried to remake this movie. And, who even would have the balls?
Right.
what do you think? Like, if someone were to do it, which I think they never will, but if someone were to remake this, do you think it would be a miniseries? Do you think it would be effective?
I think it could be, and I definitely think it could be a miniseries because, like you said, it's a series of vignettes. And I felt this way about the movie, is that I was never bored with any of the certain sections of the movie or any of the characters that they go to. I mean, they all have really interesting things to say about him, and all the flashbacks are very interesting. So I definitely think you could do more with each of those kind of sequences. And I do think that would work today. There's I think a pretty good chunk of the audience out there who would respond to a show like that about everybody. He'd be like a billionaire. He'd be like he's like an Elon Musk or a Mark Cuban type figure, and people are into that for some reason. So I think if they did that, it was like a thinly veiled version of whatever billionaire they wanted it to be. I think you could sell that.
A few episodes from now, we're going to talk about 1950, and the movie we watched that you assigned me for 1950 was Sunset Boulevard, in which Hedda Hopper plays herself. And funny story that I heard about Citizen Kane, so this movie was not a huge deal when it came out.
Right.
It gained notoriety. You mentioned already that it did not win the Oscar, and part of that was it didn't really play in theaters until... not widely until almost a decade later.
Mm-hmm. It did win. I should say it did win the original screenplay.
Of course it did.
It was your favorite award. So.
One of the reasons that it was so held back was because, and if you watch the movie Mank, which is about the making of this movie, you'll know that William Randolph Hearst was a great enemy of the writer and the director of this film, partially because this movie is supposedly about him or heavily influenced by him. And Hedda Hopper, who was a Hollywood gossip columnist at the time, to trump a rival who was closer to Hearst, told Hearst when she saw the movie that the movie was all about him. How come she didn't tell you about this? And Hearst lost it and tried to have the movie completely. He tried to have the movie burned. That makes it feel it's a lot more like a Trump parallel. Because you get the feeling that someone like Elon Musk, or who's the dude who owns Starbucks, or who, those guys, that they would be like, you know what? Show it, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing film for how much he had to go through just to get it made and just to get it seen. And yet it took so long, and he was so perseverant. The story behind it, again, a lot of people don't know, is that, Orson Welles was, 23, 24 years old when he was working on this movie. And it was kind of a hot property when he was making it because, there were people trying to stop it. And he was given control over the film, basically. He kind of had the final cut, which was super rare back then, especially for somebody so young. It was, basically unheard of, and that's just another one of the cool little tidbits that I think makes just a cool movie, and one that deserves its place where it's generally put.
I don't think it's the best movie of all time.
Sure.
I haven't seen a lot of movies from 1941, but I assume it's one of the best movies of the year, if not the best.
Sure.
I think it's wild that this was made and came out before American intervention in World War II, and yet someone playing Hitler has a cameo in the movie, which is just insane. It's very interesting to watch movies that are 80 years old and try to place them in history at the time. It's pretty hard to do that because they feel sort of like frozen in amber, but this one's very easy to place in its historical context, and it's a trip to do it.
Definitely.
I find it interesting that people thought that Orson Welles was so handsome and had leading man energy, because I'm watching it. As I was watching it, I'm like, this feels like a guy who made himself a leading man, not a guy who the world was clamoring.
Well, and I think the way he looks too fits the character of it, because the real Kane wouldn't have been a good-looking man. He just wanted to be a powerful. It was about being a powerful man.
I also, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. This is so funny. So he ages himself up a lot in the movie, and I actually thought the makeup, the old person makeup for both him and his second wife was pretty good, and for his friend who's Joseph Cotton. Also, the fact that, we have to talk about this. I'm going to interrupt myself. These are all, most of the cast's first movie. These were all people that were part of his theater troupe, and this is their first movie, and they all do a great job. It's wild. But anyway, the age-up makeup is pretty good, especially for the time. What is less good, to me, is how there's a scene near the end where Kane is destroying his now ex-wife's bedroom, and he's just stomping around like Godzilla because he thinks that's what an old man would look like. And it reminded me of the inverse of Robert De Niro as an old man playing a young man beating a guy up in The Irishman, where it's people should not do physical activity when they are playing an age that is not the age that they actually are.
There were two other small things about it, though, that I did want to mention, because there were two other things that it kind of popularized that hadn't been done much before. One of them was deep focus, where the camera would be focusing not on what was in the forefront, but what was going on in the background, which was not a thing much back then. And then it also was one of the first movies that had ceilings, where these really high ceilings, where it used to be the set, everything was shot on the set, so you wouldn't ever see any ceilings, everything would look real small. And this is one you walk into that big room, it's got that giant fireplace, and the ceiling is this big tall ceiling. It's super impressive and just looks awesome. And those were just a couple of the other things that they did that really made it stand out.
Well, it's interesting, the ceilings bit, especially because it's one of the first movies that necessitated a ceiling, because he wanted to do the low angle shots so that Kane could seem more imposing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Actually, I had two questions for you, as someone who probably is much more familiar with, definitely much more familiar with this movie than I am.
Oh, I've seen it probably 20 times, yeah.
So there are certain scenes where different characters, mostly Kane, but other characters too, are cast in shadow, and I didn't know what that represented or what that was meant to mean.
I don't have a good recollection of that.
Okay, so I'll have to look that up at some point. And then the other one is, and I think the answer to this is probably pretty simple, but there's a scene, Kane and his second wife are at their fancy camping retreat, and they're arguing in their tent, and you hear a woman screaming, a woman who's not either of them, but a woman at the party screaming while his wife is yelling at him. And it's never addressed. It's a pretty weird moment. And it seems to me that it's like meant to represent like the anguish that she's feeling that she can't let out in front of him.
Right.
But it's like a weird moment that it's loud, it's strange, and it's never, like, neither of them bring it up.
Gosh, you just hit on two things that I like I said, I've just seen the movie a bunch of times, and those are two things I don't really. I think the shadow thing might have just again just been a different way to shoot. Again, because they weren't doing a lot of lighting that way back then, so it just was another whole different way to shoot for the movie to look different, and look more like like you see the shadows and this the tall ceilings and all that. I think it was maybe just a stylistic choice just for the way it looked.
Speaking of the deep focus piece that you mentioned a minute ago, it's especially noticeable in the scene where Kane's a child and the banker is coming to adopt him and take him away. And everyone in the foreground, middle ground, and background, it's all in focus. And it reminded me, we don't actually see that much where everything's in focus because it makes everything look a bit more cartoony. Because in a cartoon, in animation, everything's flat focused. Not CGI so much, but in cell animation. But the movie that brought that back for live action is a movie that I know you don't like. It's Speed Racer. Oh, and the reason they did it in Speed Racer was because they wanted the movie to feel like a cartoon. And everything there shot very intentionally in that way. And you can either handle it or you can't. It's a very loud, noisy movie that's edited very oddly. But I just thought it was interesting that all these years later, even like the Wachowskis take a beat from Citizen Kane to make a movie that could not be more different than Citizen Kane.
Yeah, they're a little bit opposite.
Although you mentioned that there was, I believe, the cinematographer for both of these films is the same.
That's correct. Yeah, Greg Toland.
Toland, who's a legendary cinematographer. I assigned you Ball of Fire.
Tell me what made you pick that, because it just doesn't. I was just kind of surprised to see that one pop up.
For sure, it's two reasons. One, I wanted us to talk about just like old school comedies, and this is nothing but a comedy. I mean, it is just straight up a goof-aloof kind of movie. I watched it in May of 2021 for the first time in honor of Gary Cooper's passing. I was doing a movie every day for the year based on something that had happened that day, and Cooper had died on that day back in, I don't know. He died back in 1961, but whatever. And it also...
Still his death birthday.
It was his death birthday regardless.
Yes.
We'll go surfing or something. That's a reference to the movie Orange County for the 5 of you who've seen that movie.
Underrated.
Very underrated movie. So this is a Howard Hawks comedy about a handsome scientist who hangs out with a bunch of old schlubby scientists, and a woman walks into their life randomly. And I don't know, I remember when I watched it, I'm like, oh man, there aren't really wide release studio comedies anymore, which is a real bummer. Comedy has sort of been ceded to television at this point. There are rom-coms that come out, but they're mostly like straight to streaming. We talked about this in our Blast from the Past episode. Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to know like what were rom-coms like back in the early 40s, and it turns out really zany.
Very zany. And I'm glad you actually mentioned Blast from the Past again, because I had lunch with friends of mine who live in California. We saw them for brunch yesterday, and we were, I don't even know how it came up, but Brendan Fraser came up somehow, and they were like, we just saw Blast from the Past because we saw it on Hulu, so we just watched it again. I was like, I just watched it too! And we had this great conversation about it. And we were all very excited that this happened. So
I would imagine he came up because he's in the new Aronofsky movie.
I think that's how, we got to it, yeah.
Yeah, he's great. So what did you think of Ball of Fire?
I love Ball of Fire, and this definitely seems like a movie that I would have seen, because I love that screwball, zany, late 30s, or early to mid 40s sort of thing. Like, I think a couple of these are on the list. My suggestions for you, I think, like It Happened One Night, His Girl Friday, and just some of those kind of movies where the dialogue is just, that kind of rat-a-tat-tat dialogue where everyone is just kind of like sound like they're making quips all the time, basically.
Everyone's so cool.
Right, like they're all awesome, and I just love the obviousness of like you said, there's exactly one good-looking guy working on this encyclopedia, and then a beautiful woman walks in, like, I wonder which one she's going to end up with. But it's great. Barbara Stanwyck's amazing. Gary Cooper's amazing. I mean, of course they end up together. They're movie stars.
For sure. It's really delightful. What I thought was funny when I was watching it was I didn't really know where the movie was going to go. It's a pretty thin plot. These scientists are making an encyclopedia. They don't know anything about women.
Nothing.
Right. And
only one of them has ever been married, and she was passed away, I think, quite a while before they all got together.
Right. So she's going to help them with that part of the encyclopedia. Meanwhile, she's like indebted to the mob. And so then the mob comes out. Then there's like all this wacky. The part I remember most is at the end. He wants to marry her. She's going to go marry one of the mobsters or something.
Yeah, because he's going after. She's not really indebted to the mob, but she just kind of wants to get away from this, her mob boyfriend.
Right.
He wants to marry her because she knows information about him. And if he marries her, then she won't testify against him.
Right.
I mean, ridiculous.
Classic.
Like, just the most ridiculous thing, yeah.
And then but the best part is this scene where all the academics are in a car rushing to the wedding, and they just all look absurd. It's basically like, if you think movies like The Absent-Minded Professor or like all these like Disney caper movies are too silly, don't watch a comedy from the 40s, because it's not going to work for you.
Yeah. His Girl Friday is not for you.
Yeah, so I really dig this one. Howard Hawks directed this. Mm. I'm not so familiar with him, outside of his name, which is super famous.
Right.
But yeah, I dig this one. So here, let's go back. I think I rated both of these lower than you on Letterboxd. I gave Citizen Kane 4 stars and Ball of Fire 3.5. Although it has aged well in my mind, I could be tempted to bump it up.
Yeah, because Citizen Kane is a 5 for me. It's just one of those movies that, all the intangibles to go with how much I actually enjoy watching it. I mean, that's an easy 5 for me. And Ball of Fire I put up again at 4.5 because I just really loved it, and I laughed out loud a lot, and it reminded me of, I'm sure you remember my favorite stand-up bit of all time, that Gary Gulman talking about the guys abbreviating the state, like when the states all had to be abbreviated.
He just tweeted about this. This is his most popular bit, and I think he's frustrated that nothing else he's ever done has been as popular.
I've seen a lot of his other stuff that I like too. I mean, he's pretty funny, that bit, and I just thought of that when as soon as I saw these guys, like putting a bunch of dudes together, putting together an encyclopedia. Yeah. Like, where's the wisecracking secretary?
Actually, it's funny talking about Ball of Fire in this way, and like thinking back fondly on it now. I just rewatched Coneheads, and I watched a few clips on YouTube, and I'm like, wait a second, is Coneheads good? Like, is there a chance that my nostalgia for it is not just nostalgia and it's actually really fun? And I watched it with my fiance, and I kept hearing her giggle at it. I'm like, Coneheads is actually good. Coneheads is actually a solid movie. And I got so excited. And then, so I put it in Letterboxd at 3.5. And then we were walking the dog, and I was like, what would you give it? And she goes 3. And I'm like, I went 3.5. And she goes, okay, but tell me why. Why do you think it's almost 4 stars? And I start talking about it. And I'm like, it's actually like a pretty funny satire of family movies, because it's just a family movie, except the family happens to be from outer space, yes. And no one's really acknowledging it. And I kept getting more and more excited. I'm like, I think Coneheads might be a 4-star movie. I think this might be like an underappreciated gem, and I don't feel weird saying that. And I kind of feel that way about Ball of Fire, where when I watched it, I'm like, this is nice. And the more I think about it, I'm like, this movie's kind of incredible.
And I think at least that I'm pretty, I don't know, maybe, I don't want to say the word generous maybe, because that makes me, I don't know, that sounds maybe pretentious, but like I'm pretty easygoing with my star ratings. It's like, oh man, I really, really love that movie, 4.5, whatever. I don't.
That's great.
Yeah, like I tend to rank things that I enjoy pretty highly just because I remember Ebert said it once. He's like, if you give a movie 3.5 or 4 stars, what difference does it make? You really enjoyed it, didn't you?
I saw someone on Twitter say, like, there's a joke, there's a joke on like Letterboxd Twitter that like 3.5 is the most common rating for a lot of reasons. One being it's the rating where you put movies that are supposed to be good, but you didn't like them that much, but you're afraid of what other people will think if you give it too low of a score. But like, no one's looking at your ratings on Letterboxd, dude. You can give it whatever you want.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's why like I gave the new Doctor Strange movie 4.5, because there wasn't a moment while I was watching it in theaters where I wasn't smiling.
Yeah.
I just got a lot of joy out of that movie.
Joy is underrated at a movie. It's like it doesn't have to be a certain way to get a certain rating. I mean, if it if it makes you feel like good all over, sure, give it 4.5 stars. Give it 5. Why not?
Right.
Why not?
For sure.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I don't know why I feel like talking about this now, but I also just watched Atomic Blonde because I really liked Bullet Train. So I watched Atomic Blonde, and there's one scene in Atomic Blonde that is unbelievable. And if even like a third of the movie had given me the feelings I got watching that scene, and if you've seen Atomic Blonde, you know what scene I'm talking about, but the rest of the movie's boring as hell. And I was like, okay, 3 stars for this scene. Why? I didn't like the movie. Why would I do this?
Yeah.
By the same token, you don't have to give a movie credit. You give it whatever you want.
Yeah. If it's a good movie with a shitty ending, you can give it 2 or 2.5 stars.
You can, or you can give it 1 because you didn't like the movie. Whatever you like. It's up to you. Yep. It's your rating. Yes. Anyway, that's how we felt about 1941. 1941, good year for movies, obviously. We will be back very soon with another year of movies where we never did it.